Good afternoon. We're delighted to welcome you today to hear Russell Shorto at New Canaan Library. Okay, where to begin? So first we have this historic moment, the 400th anniversary of the founding of New York City, an origin story that's as wildly creative and consequential as it is complex, reflecting in its DNA the thrilling highs and the troubling lows of which we are all capable. Coming up in 2026, there's the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, whose expression of American ideals, including freedom, equality, and the rule of law, is as fundamental as it is endlessly debatable. And then weaving it all together, we have Russell Shorto, in whom we find that alchemical combination, a historian who researches with remarkable insight and exactitude, and a storyteller who keeps us turning pages well into the night. His work has been called spirited, revelatory, masterful. The Wall Street Journal described Shorto's best-selling Island at the Center of the World as, quote, a tour de force, a masterpiece of storytelling and first-rate intellectual history, end quote. Today, we are honored to have Russell here for part two of that story with his new book, Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America. Please help me welcome Russell Shorto.
Thanks. What a wonderful crowd. Thank you so much. You know what? Thank you very much, Mickey. And I want to thank Chris Skipper. Chris, where are you? Oh, there you are, right in front, or Schipper, I guess I should give it the Dutch spin, for suggesting that I come here. And I'm so delighted, I'm so amazed by this new library and how it was planned seemingly around, redefining what a library is and how well used it is by the community. So bravo to all of you. It's when you have a new book out, you're launching it, and you start out when you're working on it, it's just you thinking, okay, I'm pretty sure my mother will read it. And then, as you start to do things and people interact, then you start to think, okay, maybe more people will read it. So thank you all for helping to launch it. This book came out on Tuesday. I think I've done 5 events in 6 nights or something like that. And now, compared to the last time I had a book out, it was in the middle of COVID, so I didn't go anywhere. There's an event in the night, and then you do like 4 podcasts in the day. And it's just amazing, the variety and the depth of the interviews. And I did this, and the publicist has been very good at booking events or booking podcasts that are, really on point with what I am writing about. But I had one this morning, and it gave me the description of it, and it goes out to 1.2 million truck drivers. And I was like, I think they missed something here, but I'll do it. And the 2 hosts, they, talked to me for a few minutes beforehand. They really had read the book, and they said, we want you to know, we really read the book. And it was a great interview. And they said, truckers, and it makes total sense if you think about it, a lot of them really like history, and they buy audiobooks to listen to, So who knew? But it's a great audience for a writer of history. Okay, so I'm going to look here. I sort of did a different selection of slides, so I'm going to let the selection dictate how I tell the story, and I've done a different selection for different places, so I have to refresh myself with what the slides are. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Len Tantillo. He's a modern historical artist. He lives across the Hudson River from Albany, and he's been a friend of his for a long time. He is the most meticulous historical researcher, and he did this painting of New Amsterdam in 1660 based on mountains of historical research. Every one of these buildings, he can tell you who owned the building and what state it was in at this moment in the history of New Amsterdam. So I think, what I try to do in writing is, to the extent that I can, using sources, make the place come alive, and Len certainly does that as well. So I started in 27 years ago. Let me back up so you're not distracted by reading while I'm talking. I started 27 years ago living in the East Village of Manhattan, and at the time I took my daughter to the nearest open space for her to run around and play in. She was a toddler, and that was the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery. And that is where Peter Stuyvesant is buried. And I would look at his tomb, and I knew a couple of random facts about New York's Dutch period. I knew Peter Stuyvesant. I knew he had a wooden leg. I knew New York was once Nieuwe Amsterdam, and that's kind of it. So I talked to some friends who were historians, and they didn't know the Dutch period. And eventually somebody put me in touch with Charles Gehring. This is just a quote from an early 20th century historian, which kind of typifies the way people have thought about this period of history. Original sources of information concerning the early Dutch are either neither many nor rich. The Dutch wrote very little, and on the whole, their records are meager. So when I met Charles Gehring, he just completely transformed my way of understanding early American history. He started in 1974 at the New York State Library in Albany, translating and publishing the 12,000 pages of records of the Dutch colony. And in 1984, Jannie Venema joined him, a Dutch historian. A few years ago, Jannie retired, and Charlie is still at it. I think he's 86. I don't know if he wants me to mention that. But he, in fact, on the 15th, on March 15th, I'm doing an event that's a fundraiser in Albany where I'll give a talk, and it will be Charlie's retirement party. And it's a fundraiser in part because he's been doing this work all this time, and the state is not hiring someone to take up after him. So this nonprofit, the New Netherland Institute, is taking on the task of hiring translators piece by piece. So it's a nonprofit. So anybody who doesn't have anything to do on March 15th, you want to do something for a good cause, you can buy a ticket to the fundraiser. I think there's still some tickets available, newnetherlandinstitute.org. But Charlie and Jannie really kind of transformed my understanding and made me see that you could understand the beginnings of American history from Lower Manhattan as well as you could from the Puritans and Pilgrims. And much flowed from that. I wrote my book, The Island at the Center of the World, based on the research and the translation work that they had done up to that time. It came out 21 years ago. To give you a quick spin through the background, and then I'll come to the main story of this book. That Dutch story begins with an Englishman, and the English and the Dutch are woven together throughout all of this history. And in fact, the current book, Taking Manhattan, that's really what it's about. It's the as I call it, the merger of English and Dutch influences. Starts with Henry Hudson, who is an Englishman who is hired by the Dutch East India Company to look for a short route to Asia. And he thinks there is a shortcut through North America. He thinks there's a channel through North America. At the time, people thought the world was about 1/3 smaller than it is. So the part that they didn't know about, so the western half of North America and some of the Pacific Ocean, they just assumed didn't exist, so that you would find this channel, and instead of getting to, say, Ohio or something, you'd be at the Sea of Japan, and the riches of Asia would be in front of you. So he goes up the coast looking for this short route. This building is still in existence. This was the headquarters of the East India Company in Amsterdam. It's now the administrative building of the University of Amsterdam. That's where he went, and they hired him. And this map is charting his voyage as he's looking for that shortcut. So he went north, went all the way south, and then comes up the coast looking for this channel. First, he thinks the Delaware River might be it. Then, when he comes to what became known as the Hudson River, he thinks he has it because it's salt water, there's a lot of salinity, and it's going north, but he thinks eventually it will jog westward. until he gets up north of present-day Albany and realizes that he's heading toward its source and it's not going to happen. He goes back to Europe and failed, but since he charted this on behalf of the Dutch laid claim to it and called the colony New Netherland. The West India Company was formed. The East India Company, which had hired him, its mission was to exploit the East Indies, which is Asia, the Spice Islands and so on. That was so wildly successful that the next logical thing is, well, let's form a West India Company and do the same thing with the so-called West Indies, which if you're in Europe and you have a standard map, that means everything to your left. So the eastern seaboard of North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And the West India Company then became the kind of overlord of this colony. Zooming in now on the area around the capital, you have Manhattan Island, and at the southern tip of Manhattan Island was where they chose to base their capital. The colony was all or parts of 5 future states: New York, New Jersey, parts of Connecticut, always in dispute, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. This map, this graphic gives you a sense of how they viewed the landscape. The Dutch were, they always, as they went around the world, they always looked at land in terms of water routes because, of course, water was the highway. There were no roads. And so in their minds, and they'd learned this from the native people early on, the Hudson River goes north about 150 miles, and then there's a confluence with the Mohawk River, which, if you can make it navigable the whole way, goes all the way to the Great Lakes. And then, if you can do that, you have access to the interior, and you've got this mind-blowing possibility, and that's what intrigued some of those early Dutch settlers. And if you jump ahead in time to the 1820s, when the Erie Canal is completed, and it is made a navigable waterway, all the cities around the Great Lakes, Buffalo and Detroit and Erie, all come into being. And the cities at that confluence, Schenectady and Troy and Albany, become these mighty little powerhouse cities. And that is the moment, the 1820s, when New York City really takes off as this conduit between all the world, where all the world's commerce, and for that matter, all the world's people can come into this massive harbor and then get processed up the Hudson, along the Erie Canal, and into the interior of the continent. So in this amazing way, there were people in the 1600s, these European settlers in this colony, who foresaw that. It didn't happen in their life, it didn't happen for them, but it did happen. I think this is an important map at this point to make the point that, of course, the landscape was already peopled, intricately peopled. And as intricate and confusing as it may seem, in fact, this is very simplified. For example, it wasn't just the Montauk on Long Island. There were the Shinnecock, there were many. For purposes of the story that I tell in Taking Manhattan, there's some importance, quite important, were the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee across upstate New York, and the Delaware, otherwise known as Lenape or Muncie, in and around New York City. This is Ganondagan, the New York State Park, which has a longhouse on its site, and I put this slide there because it immediately, when you actually visit a longhouse, you get it. You feel like you're in. This is a civilization, this is a society, this is how families and extended families, and then a village of longhouses surrounded by a wall or fence. It feels like these are people who are just as smart and with just as much guile and looking toward a future as were the Europeans who were here. So that circumscribes roughly what was New Netherland. And you can see it generously takes in a good bit of Connecticut in the eyes of the Dutch. And there were 3 river systems, because again, what they cared about was waterways. The Delaware, which they called the South River, the Hudson, which they called the North, and the Connecticut River, which they called the Fresh River. The name of the game early on, the reason they set, the main reason that they established this colony was animal furs, particularly beaver. And they did this, they set up the colony not in order to trap beavers themselves. The idea was the native people trapped them and traded with them. And that was important to the whole life of the colony because it was a two-way street, and it was something that the native people benefited from as well. The Europeans wanted furs, which they would send to Europe and were very valuable, and the native people wanted European manufactured goods. And I'll surely talk in a moment or two about the various wars that broke out, which are horrific and are what I think grabs people's attention when you're thinking about European and native relations in this period. But I think it's important to keep in mind they were all locked in a complicated dance for trade. They were all in it for something. They all saw value in this. The story that I told in The Island at the Center of the World, and I see this book as kind of a sequel to it, was about the Dutch colony, which lasted for about 40 years. And I focused it on a showdown between two people. Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last and the most consequential director of the colony. He lasted for its last 17 years. And on the right there, Adrian van der Donck, who was nominated by the population as their spokesperson against Stuyvesant and the West India Company. So he was kind of the leader of the opposition party. And he came to represent the interests of the people on the ground who felt that the West India Company did not have their interests at heart. And that led to a dramatic clash between the two of them. And out of that comes much of the heritage of the Dutch into New Amsterdam and New Netherland. At the height of the clash, Stuyvesant imprisoned van der Donck. He eventually let him out, and van der Donck fled to Europe, leading a commission there to argue on behalf of the people in the colony, that the Dutch government should take a role in its affairs. And while he was there, he wrote this book, the beschrijvingen or description of New Netherland. It was the first time that Europeans heard of these areas, and he described, he roamed widely in this part of the world, and he described for people the flora, the fauna. He said, that the animals are bigger and fiercer, the trees grow taller. When we plant crops, they grow more abundantly. So he really talked up America. And he ended up getting hundreds of people wanting to emigrate. He hired ships and brought shiploads of settlers. So he did this one-man kind of boostering for America. The upshot of what the Dutch brought, not just to New Amsterdam, but to New Netherland, as I argued in The Island at the Center of the World, is two things. It was a densely multi-ethnic community, which was made possible by an official policy of tolerance or religious toleration, which made the Dutch unusual in Europe. In most other countries, intolerance was official policy, because people thought that it's a very dangerous world, and if we're going to be strong as a society, that means everybody has to be on the same page, and religion was the big divider of people. The Dutch flew in the face of that and created a society based on tolerance and a multi-ethnic society. They had the melting pot of Europe. And they did that partly because the Dutch landscape, it's basically one vast river delta, and it was easy for people from other parts of Europe to flee to if they were escaping persecution. And because the Dutch were a seafaring people, which made them learn different languages, they learned different perspectives, and they learned that they could actually make money and turn tolerance into an advantage. So that made their society distinct, and it therefore made their colony on this continent distinct. At the same time, the Dutch were pioneering the principles of capitalism long before the word itself came into being. The building there is the world's first stock exchange that was built in Amsterdam. On the top there is, if you've ever stood on Wall Street, in the middle of the street, I don't know when this was done, but the city put these markers in their little wooden blocks to show where the original wall went, which was the northern perimeter of the town of New Amsterdam, and it's not a coincidence that Wall Street became synonymous with American finance, because the Dutch were the great exponents of this new type of finance in Europe. Last year, I curated an exhibit at the New York Historical called New York Before New York, and this is, as Mickey noted, this is the 400th anniversary of New Amsterdam and therefore of New York. It's complicated, but last year, so 1624 might be the year that you look as the founding, or you might look to 1625, or you might look to 1626. So what that means for people like me is, well, you can have your 400th anniversary in 2024, 2025, or 2026. So we had this exhibit last year, and we brought several artifacts, very rare and precious artifacts related to this period. One of which was the Castello Plan, which is a map of New Amsterdam in 1660 at about its height. It's oriented, so this is south, so it's a little bit confusing. But so along the right there is the wall at what was Wall Street. Along the top it was originally a native trail called the Wakaskek Trail, and the Dutch called it the Herenweg, the Gentleman's Way, and then the English called it Broadway. You can see the fort very prominently there, and when I've given tours, because this is now the financial district, and when I have given tours, it's handy because the street pattern is still the same. People often ask me what's left of the Dutch colony. The street pattern of the financial district is New Amsterdam. So what I say is just don't look up at the skyscrapers. That kind of ruins the effect. But on the site now of the fort is the Alexander Hamilton Custom House, which was about the same size. So that it's convenient for trying to envision these things. This is a fascinating, rare object that we had in the exhibit. The Dutch always wanted to get their paperwork done. And so in 1626, they wanted to negotiate a deed for Manhattan Island. The deed has been lost, but this letter in which a Dutch government official wrote shortly after to his bosses talking about what was going on in this new colony mentions it. And if you look the sixth line down, it says, "Het eiland Manhattan." So you can see that mention of the island of Manhattan. So what he's saying is our people have bought the island of Manhattan for the value of 60 guilders. An infamous, this would get translated in the 20th century as $24. So the notion of the ultimate swindling the native people out of this island for such a ridiculous sum. I could talk for a long time about what is and is not true about that, but what I'll just say briefly is that the Dutch understood that the native people did not have a notion of real estate, that to them what they were entering was an alliance, saying, we want you here because we want to trade for your goods, and we'll let you live here, and we're going to stay here too, we'll come as often as we want, and in exchange, if one of us is attacked, the other one will help out. And that is presumably how the Dutch operated initially. But over years then, once they got demonstrably stronger than the native people, they just said, no, we've got a deed, you've got to get out, and they started pushing them out, and then it would happen again and again, and really that's the story of the spread of what became America and what became the United States, if you keep going across the continent. This lovely 1664 watercolor of New Amsterdam was made just at the moment New Amsterdam was becoming New York. And so you can keep that in mind now as I start to get into the story of taking Manhattan, because in this face-off in the harbor between the English and the Dutch, which is what the new book is about, this is what they're fighting for. This is what's at stake. It's a map of the area that the Dutch created. This slide is reminding me to make the point that there were really three cultures we're talking about here: the native, the European, and the African cultures, because African slavery is very much a part of the story. So again, in the exhibit on the left here, this basket was found in New Amsterdam, or it was dug up in the financial district in the 1980s. It was excavated, and in it were all of these objects below. This is called an impungu. Impungu means collection, and it was a collection that in West Central African culture, a healer would gather certain items together for the purpose of healing either an individual or a whole society. And it would be in a basket. That plate was on the top of the basket. So the idea was it would be uncovered regularly. And the healer would normally have his mouth have like alcohol, like brandy, and then spray it over the items to animate the object. That's one of the very few remnants of African culture found in New Amsterdam associated with it. The portrait is of a man thought to be a Lenape warrior who was captured by the Dutch during Keith's War in the middle of the Dutch period. And that's a rendering of a longhouse village. And I showed you the longhouses, the inside of a longhouse before. Okay, so the new book now. I've talked a lot about the Dutch side. Now, what I mainly do in the new book is bring the English into the picture. And England in the 17th century was a bitterly divided society, which feels familiar to us today, I think. Starting in the early part of the century, the Puritans and other religious sects began to grow in power. The King James I, and early in the century, had trouble with them, but he was able to kind of push them aside. King Charles I tried the same thing, but by then they were much more significant. A lot of Parliament was given over to the Puritans, and one aspect of the struggle between the monarchy and the Puritans was that the Puritans wanted to purify the faith, and they believed it should be the essence of faith was in the individual, in the spirit of the individual, whereas in the Church of England, it was in the church and in the head of the church, and the king was the head of the church. So this was an affront to the king. At the height of the tension, you have in 1649 the beheading of Charles I by the Puritans. Oliver Cromwell in the center there becomes the leader of England, the Puritan, and the beheading is over there on that, depicted on that contemporary engraving. You've got the Civil War, vicious Civil War, the beheading of the king, a Puritan rule, and all the things that we associate with that, the outlawing of dancing and card playing and Christmas, and the society was really divided into two camps. You had the Puritans, and then you had what they called the Royalists, what historians call the Royalists, but it doesn't mean that they all were just mad about royalty. What it means is they were anti-Puritan. They didn't want the Puritans controlling every aspect of society. So that this war transpires over the course of a number of years, right in the middle of the century. After the king is beheaded, his two sons, the princes, go into exile on the continent. And there are many people in England and many people around them who are machinating for them to get back on the throne. Among them is a man named Richard Nichols, who as a writer of history, I think you've hit gold when you have found a person who did enormously consequential things and nobody's heard of, because then you got this chance to, and that's what Richard Nichols is. Richard Nichols was born in this place, this village called Ampthill in Bedfordshire. I took these pictures when I was there. Went with my wife and son, and the local historian took us around the sites. And it was the town was surrounded by, Henry VIII organized it into the royal hunting ground. So then Charles I, before he became beheaded, would go there all the time because he was a great hunter, and with his family. And his two young sons, the princes, Charles and James, would come. The keeper of this hunting estate was Richard Nichols' father. So this man I'm talking about, Richard Nichols, grew up with these young princes. Then when the Civil War happens, he sides with them. His whole family sides with them. They've known him. They've known the royals all their lives. And when they go into exile, he goes with them. He fights with them. Then in 1660, the Puritan rule ends and the Stuarts come back onto the throne. Richard Nichols comes with them. They now look across the Atlantic Ocean. They say, we're thinking about empire and we're looking at America. And this is kind of what they have in mind. They have New England, which is English colonies to the north, they've got settlements at Maryland and Virginia to the south. And in between is this Dutch colony. And the Dutch are the longtime rivals of the English, the nemesis. The English are very envious of the Dutch, who have gained all this economic supremacy. So they have now two problems in America if they're going to organize and create money-making colonies there. One problem is the Dutch. So they want this emissary they're going to send with warships to deal with the Dutch and get them out of there. The second problem is New England, because New England, of course, was settled by the Puritans and Pilgrims. And these are the people who just cut off the head of their father. And who still bitterly oppose them. They need someone who is very savvy, very capable, can think on his feet, because once he gets here, he's not going to be able to phone home and say, you know, it's a little complicated. They go to this man they've known all their life, and they ask Richard Nicolls to do this. So he leads 4 ships, 450 men, the ship's packed to the gills with gunpowder. And so he sails into the Anglo-Dutch Wars. There's Peter Stuyvesant again. This is going to be the face-off. Peter Stuyvesant on the far side. And this is not Richard Nicolls. There is no image of Richard Nicolls. I've looked everywhere. But this guy, George Goring, it was the same age as Richard Nicolls. He had the same rank on the Royalist Army. He was a colonel. And there's a physical description of Nicolls, and it pretty much fits this. So you can use George Goring as your stand-in for Richard Nicolls. Okay, so now it's the late summer of 1664, and here's the setup. Richard Nicolls and his ships sail into New York Harbor. So just to orient you, you can see Manhattan Island up the top and Nieuwe Amsterdam at the tip. You see the Dutch towns on Long Island. Vlissingen, which became Flushing. These are all sort of corrupted names. Breukelen became Brooklyn. Vlakkerbos becomes Flatbush. And then you see Gravesend. Gravesend is really interesting because now I mentioned that, so these are Dutch towns. They're in the Dutch colony, but they are mixed towns because this is, the Dutch brought this mixed society, and the famous statistic is 18 languages being spoken in New Amsterdam when there were only about 500 people. So I like to say New York was New York even before it was New York. So these are mixed towns under Dutch auspices. But Gravesend was founded by Lady Deborah Moody, an Englishwoman who had left England because of religious persecution, went to New England, was persecuted there because her Protestant brand of Protestantism did not sit well with the mullahs of Boston. And the Dutch, in situations like this, they waved their little tolerance flag and said, come here, we'll, put up with anyone as long as they'll pay their way. So she founded a town, Gravesend, which was populated by English. Richard Nicolls knew this. Richard Nicolls, before he left London, had done a great deal of homework. He interviewed people who had lived in New Netherland. He interviewed and brought with him a man who had an Englishman who had formerly worked in Stuyvesant's government. He knew what was going on. He knew the lay of the land here. So his flotilla of ships makes for Gravesend Bay, and that's where they anchor. He doesn't go right to Manhattan. And then begins the really interesting thing. What transpires now takes place over 2 weeks. And it's, again, Richard Nicolls' orders and what he's got in his ships makes clear what his tool of choice. He's going to lay waste to the place. But what starts to happen now is Nicolls sends a boat with messengers to New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant contemplates, writes back, sends, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And they're feeling each other out, and they're both battle-hardened warriors. Stuyvesant famously lost his leg in battle against the Spanish in the Caribbean. They're both ready to fight, but they're both feeling each other out, trying to figure out what's going on and what the best solution to this this is really kind of geopolitics going on in this little out-of-the-way place. Ultimately, what they come to is, and several times, one or the other is about to fight. One of those, each time they are talked down. At one point, Stuyvesant is about to fight. He and his soldiers want to fight, but the people around him, and in fact, most of the town, and the interesting thing about this is most of the people in the town, they're all there looking out at the water when Nicolls pulls his ships out and aims his cannons, they're watching this, and they are making themselves known. So this is really kind of democracy in action. So at one point, when Stuyvesant's ready to fight, 2 women slip out of the fort, they cross the East River, and they make their way to Gravesend and meet with Nichols. One of those women was the wife of Stuyvesant's secretary and the daughter of a prominent person in Stuyvesant's government. So, and what they did is they told Richard Nichols what was going on in New Amsterdam and how the people felt. So this was an interesting, the point I'm making here is New Amsterdam was not, the Dutch, so-called Dutch in New Amsterdam were not all of a piece. Stuyvesant at times wanted to fight and his counselors didn't, and this was a case where they sent women because women were kind of invisible. Women were not official messengers or diplomats. So they sent these 2 women to kind of bring things down, to lower the temperature. So several times during this, it builds up and then it lessens again. And ultimately, what they are come to work out is, from Nichols' perspective, he understood that the Dutch were doing something special in New Amsterdam, that they had this multi-ethnic society. That he didn't know, of course, they didn't know the word capitalism, but they were financing things in an interesting way. They were sending shipments and bringing shipments from all sorts of places. Nobody had seen anything like this before, and he wanted to keep it. And if he laid waste, he would have the real estate, but then what? What he wanted was the secret sauce. He wanted the only way to get that was to keep these people here. From the Dutch side, Stuyvesant and the people around him had been trying for years to get the West India Company to support them. They had been saying, look at this colony, look at what we're doing here, and look at this continent that nobody knows how vast it is. What we can do, all we need is your support. Send soldiers, send more settlers. And it fell on deaf ears. The Dutch West India Company, the government, just was not going to listen. They were fed up with that. So in this standoff, in this back and forth, what these 2 men hashed out, and not just these 2 men, there were a lot of people involved, what they hashed out was, and I read books on negotiation while I was working on this part of this. In classic negotiations, you ask yourself, what do I want? What do I need to get out of this? What does the other guy want? What do they need? Can I see their humanity? Can I see them as a human and see that they can flourish in this? What they worked out was an agreement, the so-called, in some places it's called the Articles of Surrender, but if it were truly Articles of Surrender, the Dutch would be told to surrender their arms, to surrender. It reads much more like a Bill of Rights. So what the Dutch negotiated for, and what, frankly, I think Nichols wanted to give them, was a guarantee. You're going to keep your home, you're going to keep your family, you'll keep your businesses. By all means, keep your trade networks all over the place. You'll have freedom of religion. Dutch ships will continue to come. Only thing, this is going to be an English city from now on. And so from Stuyvesant's side, his creativity and his challenge, what he had to wrestle with in this time period, was realize. So he had been tasked with, of course, the main thing that the leader has to do is defend the colony. So he has a loyalty to the West India Company, he has a loyalty to his government at home, but ultimately he decides that his greatest loyalty is to the people here on the ground and to this society that he has in many ways built himself and helped to build. And he decides that the way to do that is to sign this agreement and let it become English. And Nichols, for his part, says, we're going to get this secret sauce and we're going to slowly make it English. We're going to keep these features in place because we want to, and we're going to keep them English. This is a little note that my colleague Jaap Jacobs found in the Dutch archives, in which once the word of this agreement goes to Europe, the Dutch leader, Johan de Witt, was actually in a meeting with George Downing, the English ambassador to the Dutch provinces, when the members of the directors of the West India Company come rushing in to say, we just found out that the English have taken our colony. And they scribble this note because they're standing outside the door while this meeting's happening and say to him, excuse me, sir, but, you might want to know this because you're meeting with the English ambassador. So it's a remarkable, snippet of, very live, tangible kind of intelligence. Okay, so then Richard Nichols takes over the place. He does several things that are remarkable. He names it New York. I found a letter in which Nichols afterwards is writing to the Duke of York. He mentions to him, almost as an aside, oh, by the way, and I gave to this place the name New York. So he just decided that on the fly, that he was going to call it that. He also, what drove Nichols crazy ultimately, he spent 4 years as governor, the first governor of New York. What drove him crazy was he had plans to develop this whole wide province. You saw the earlier map. And then shortly after he starts to work on it in earnest, he gets word from the home country that the Duke of York has decided, because they didn't have any conception of these vast chunks of land here. He decided, a friend of his who had helped him during the Civil War was the governor of Jersey. He said, I'm going to give you a whole chunk of it. It's on the other side of the what we call the Hudson River. And Nichols was like, you can't do that. We've got our colony, we've got Manhattan Island here. You can't just make the other side of the river a whole other separate colony. So it drove him crazy. He said, please don't take this and name it New Jersey. Why don't you give, and at one point he says, why don't you give him Delaware? Delaware's a really nice, so, but the decision was made, and I think that's ultimately why Nichols got fed up after 4 years and went back. Nichols also commissioned this very detailed map of Manhattan and the area around it. It's called the Nichols map. And you can see how beautifully sort of crenellated the island is in its original state with all these little coves and inlets. And you can see it's done for people in Europe who don't know what they're looking at. Down here it says, part of the continent of America. And up there it says, part of Long Island. So they're just orienting you. And all the way at the tip there is Nieuwe Amsterdam. And then up here at the top, you can see the other settlement at New Haarlem. That's the Duke of York, dressed as Mars, the god of war. So 1664, Nieuwe Amsterdam becomes New York. Beverwijk becomes Albany because he was also the Duke of Albany, and in fact, Nichols wanted to name what became New Jersey, Albania, also after him. But and then lots of place names go back, of course, to the Dutch period. Haarlem, Brooklyn, Staten Island was named after the States General, the governing body. So, in sum, what they did is they invented a new city that had these features of Dutchness. It would be multi-ethnic, relatively tolerant, free trading, but it would carry on as an English city as the British Empire got going. The other side of Nichols' mission, I won't go into all that, concerns his failure with the New England colonies. So in failing, Boston remained and became even stronger as a Puritan base. And what that sets up then are two competing ideologies. And as a writer, I think what I'm most interested in is how ideas travel, and it's impossible, I admit, it's impossible to trace ideas neatly. They don't work like that. But I still think it's worthwhile because that's how we figure out who we are. But you've got these two originating American ideologies, one based in New York with this Dutch and English background, which is multi-ethnic and tolerant, relatively pragmatic and relatively outward-looking globally, and the other based in Boston, which is inward, theocratic, which sees God favors us if we're succeeding, and therefore this is the promised land, and therefore in the 19th century it becomes manifest destiny. We have this right to take control of the continent. And I think you can look at American history ever since, in a way, as a battle between these two competing ideologies, even right to where we are today. And that's what an English editor described to me this, he said, after he read the book, said, so what you're describing is an inherited trauma from England. And we've never sort of sorted it out. I always love the sort of before and after, the idea that you can take that early settlement and superimpose it on the financial district. The greatest thing in doing history is the idea of wondering, the wonder at what is here now and what it came from. I will leave it at that. Thank you all very, very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Russell.